Hello and welcome back. Today we are continuing on with our finance chapter. And today's section we're going to talk about simple interest. So let's talk about simple interest. It is the most basic type of interest. And many of you might notice this formula. It's been covered in previous algebra courses, so it may look familiar. But basically, when you're trying to find the interest of a simple interest loan, you're going to take the principal, which if you look down here is the amount of money borrowed, times the rate, which is the rate of interest. Now we always write, you'll be given the rate in a percent, written as a percent, but when we put it into the equation, we always need to change it into a decimal. And then times time. Now notice what I put here. This is very important. It's always expressed in terms of years. And I'm going to say this, but all the examples today, I'm going to show you when it's not a year. So when we're using the formula, and this is your formula right here, I equals PRT. If you're given in terms of years, so let's say the loan was for 2 years, you would just plug in 2 for time. If it was 5 years, you plug in 5 for time. What if it's not in terms of years, but maybe months? Well, we're going to do some examples today where you can see how we would put that in. Now here we're going to talk about ordinary interest. Oops. And with ordinary interest, we are looking at the most common type of simple interest. And basically each month we assume to be about 30 days and a year would be 12 months, which averages, if we're just talking about averaging, then we're saying 360 days. On the due date, that should say on, the borrower must repay the principal plus the interest. And let's just go ahead and jump right into an example so you can see how we would apply this. So Sherry needs to borrow $6,200 to replace the air conditioner in her home. From her credit union, Sherry obtains a 30-month loan with an annual simple interest rate of 5.75%. Part A. Calculate the simple interest she is charged on the loan. All right. As soon as I see the word simple interest, I like to write down the formula. I equals PRT. Now, in this case, it's asking us to find the interest, so that would be I. Well, now we have to figure out what all the variables, numbers that go with the variables. So, for example, the principal is how much she's borrowing. Well, we were told that that is $6,200. The rate, right here, that is 5.75%. Well, remember, we need to turn this into a decimal. Now, this is what we did in the previous video. Two videos ago. Remember, you move the decimal 2 places to the left. So what we're going to put in the equation would be 0.0575. And then times time. Well, be careful. It says that the loan is 30 months. But time is in terms of years with this equation. Well, if you think about it, there are 12 months in a year. So if I'm given the loan in terms of months, then I just need to put it over 12. And that would put it in terms of years. So we would say 30 divided by 12. And that way, that is my times in terms of years. If you were to divide that, you get 2.5 years. Now we do the calculations. This is where sometimes the errors happen. If you're using a basic calculator, I would recommend working your way backwards. Take 30 divided by 12 first, then hit enter. Then take that answer times 0.0575 times 6,200. So go ahead and try that on your calculator to make sure we're all matching up. And you can always pause if you need to. But we should get $891. And we always round to the nearest cent, so that would be 25 cents. Now part B says to determine the amount principal plus interest she will pay the credit union at the end of the 30 months to pay off her loan. Okay, we know what the interest is. Now here is the formula we're just going to look at. This is like total amount. Okay, so I'll put A is total amount. Because remember, you're paying back not only what you borrowed, which is the P, that's the principal, but you also have to pay the bank interest. That's where they're making their profit from. So our formula then would just be to take the principal plus the interest. In this case, she's borrowing $6,200, and then she has to pay the bank $891.25 in interest. All in total, she's going to pay back $7,091.25. So that would be what she would pay at the end altogether to have borrowed that money. All right, let's try another example. To obtain money for new eyeglasses, Gilbert decides to pawn his trumpet. He borrows $240 and after 30 days gets his trumpet back by paying the pawnbroker $288. What annual rate of interest did Gilbert pay? Okay, well, think about what the question is asking. We've got our simple interest loan, and our formula, and it's asking what annual rate of interest did he pay? That means we want to find R in this case. All right, well, we've got everything else. We know what P is. In fact, let's just label it this time. So P is how much he borrowed, and that was $240. We don't know what R is, right? That's the question. Time. Well, it says that after 30 days, he gets his trumpet back. 30 days, okay, over, actually, well, let me do it two ways. The 360, because remember we said we average. I know you're going to say, but there's 365 days. But the formula does an average of 30 days per month times 12. But this is also the same thing as 1 over 12. And do we know what I is? Do we know what the interest is? Let's go back to the problem. It says that he borrowed $240 and he paid $288 to get it back. That's your total amount. Then what I could do is subtract, because wouldn't they be interest? Wouldn't the interest be the total amount he paid, the total amount he borrowed, and subtract the two? In that case, that means $48 would be the interest. All right, now we're ready to plug into the formula. So 48, that's your I, equals P, that's your 240, times R, we don't know what that is, and then times 12. Once you do this part right here, then you're ready to just plug everything into the formula. And look, I'm going to rewrite this using the commutative law, and we'll put R there. So all I'm doing is just pushing this over here so that we know we just need to multiply these. Now the next step. You're going to want to take 240 times 1/12 or 240 divided by 12. They will both get you to the same answer, but that gives us to 20R. Now, remember when you are solving for an equation, whatever's in front of the variable, that's what we want to divide by. So we're going to divide both sides by 20 because what happens is it cancels out on the right-hand side. That allows us to solve for the rate. I take 48 divided by 20 and we'll round to the nearest tenth. I think that's all we need. And that's 2.4. Now we're not done. That's not our answer. That's our rate, but as a decimal. Remember, we want to look at our rate as a percent. Well, if you remember what we talked about, when we change a decimal to a percent, we're multiplying by 100 or moving the decimal place 2 places to the right. That means that the interest rate was, 240%. One last problem. These are kind of quick because simple interest is it's a basic form of interest and the formula is pretty basic. But let's talk about a discount note. Now, nothing's changing as far as our formula goes. But what happens is the interest is paid at the time the borrower receives the loan. The interest charges in advance, and we call that a bank discount. Let me show you how it works. Here's our example. Joel took out a $500 loan using a 10% discount note. So when I see the word discount note, bank discount, it automatically tells me we're working with simple interest. Takes it for 3 months. Now, part A, the interest we want to find, oops, let me just put that down a little bit, the interest he must pay to the bank on the date he receives the loan. Okay, again, we're looking at our formula, I equals PRT. Now, we want to find the interest. We know he borrowed $500. Now, the rate is 10%. Again, write that as a decimal. So you move it 2 places to the left or divide by 100. Either way, we should get to 0.10. And then for 3 months, so we're going to put 3 over 12. Now remember, if this was for 3 years, you would just put 3 into the formula. There's no adjusting needed. Now we do the math. This is where I always say work backwards. Take 3 divided by 12 first. Then multiply that by 0.10 and then times 500. And we get $12.50 for the interest. Part B says, but what's the net amount of money he receives? Because notice we were talking about this was a discount note. That means that this $12.50 is going to get paid up front. Well, then that means instead of $500, he's got to pay the interest, which means he's really getting $487.50 because the interest had to be paid up front before receiving the loan. So that's what he would net. That's what that means. Well, then the next question says, well, then what's the actual rate of interest for the loan? Now you might think, well, it's 10%. Not technically, no. And this is why. Yes, he's borrowing $500, but because the interest was paid up front, we're netting $487.50. Well, that means we do actually have a slightly, we'll call it our adjusted interest rate. And we know what the interest is. The new principal is what he nets. All right, now we want to find R in this case, and our time is still the same. That has not changed. You could change that to 1/4 if you wanted to. All right, well, let's do some math here. Now, I'm going to rearrange like I did before. Oops, forgot the equal sign. 487.50. And remember, I'm just using the commutative law and putting the R at the end. This way, you can take 3 divided by 12, then multiply that by the 487.50. Now, with rounding, I try not to round until close to the very end. I write out as much as I can, but that's what we get there. We're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to solve for R, which means we're going to divide both sides by the number that was in front of the R. This way, we can get our interest rate. Now, just divide. It will be a small number because it shouldn't be much more than the 10%. If I don't round for 4 decimals, this is what I get. And then what I would do is round the interest rate to the nearest 10th. I'm going to say 10th, and we're going to do percent. That means I'm moving my decimal 2 places to the right. And if I'm rounding to the nearest 10th, that means my actual interest rate is really 10.3%. All right, and so that is how the discount note would work. And that ends our simple interest video.